The summer of 1977 started the same way it always did in the Cherokee Hills of northeastern Oklahoma. Families made the drive up to Camp Scott, a Girl Scout camp sitting on the edge of Ten Killer Lake, where the water turned copper at sunset and the tree line smelled like pine resin and red clay. Parents dropped their daughters off on the afternoon of June 12th. They hugged them goodbye at the front gate. They drove home. By the following morning, 3 of those girls would be dead. Lori Lee Farmer was 10 years old. Michelle Goose was 9. Doris Milner was 8. They had been assigned to Tent 1, a canvas sleeping structure near the edge of the woods, on the very first night of camp. Sometime before dawn, someone entered that tent. Someone who had been watching. Someone who had been waiting. What investigators found when the sun came up that morning is the kind of detail that stays with you. The girls had been dragged a short distance from the tent into the tree line. They were found together. And just a few hundred feet away, in the main cabin area, more than 100 other girls and their counselors had slept through the entire night without hearing a sound. That detail alone tells you something about the silence of what happened in those woods. But here is what makes the Camp Scott murders more than a tragedy. What makes them a case that still does not fully make sense nearly 50 years later is what investigators found before the murders ever happened. Weeks before camp opened, a maintenance worker doing a routine check of the grounds found something tucked inside one of the tents. A handwritten note. The note was explicit. It named Girl Scouts. It described exactly what was going to happen. Camp administration was informed. The note was handed over, and Camp Scott opened on schedule anyway. The decision to open that camp after receiving a specific, written, credible threat against the children in it was never adequately explained. The people who made that decision were never held to the same scrutiny as the man eventually charged with the murders. That man was Gene Leroy Hart, a local Cherokee man with a prior criminal record who had escaped from prison in 1973 and had been living somewhere in the hills and caves of the surrounding area for years. Hart was known in the community. He had connections to people near the camp. When investigators brought him in, they believed they had their man. The trial lasted weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Gene Leroy Hart was acquitted on all charges. The Cherokee community, many of whom had sheltered Hart during his years as a fugitive, celebrated outside the courthouse. The families of Lori, Michelle, and Doris did not. The lead investigator, a man named Gary Stansel, who had spent years building the case, said afterward that he never doubted Hart's guilt. He went to his grave believing it. Hart died in prison in 1979, less than a year after his acquittal, from what was officially recorded as heart failure. He was 35 years old. The physical evidence collected from the scene included hair samples that matched Hart. It included a ski mask found near his known hideout that matched fibers recovered from one of the victims. These were the days before DNA testing. The defense argued contamination, planted evidence, and racial bias in the investigation. The jury agreed with enough of it to acquit. And today, if you drive out to the site of Camp Scott, you will find the buildings still standing. The cabins, the dining hall, the pathways between them. Nature has been reclaiming it for almost 50 years. The Girl Scouts of America permanently closed the camp after the murders. No buyer has ever successfully developed the land. Some of the counselors who were there that first night have spoken publicly over the years. One of them, who was 19 years old in 1977 and had been assigned to a cabin not far from Tent 1, described waking up at some point during the night to a sound she could not identify. Not a scream, not a voice, just a sound that was wrong, the way a sound in the woods can sometimes register in your body before your brain has processed it. She rolled over and went back to sleep. She has spent the rest of her life thinking about that. The case was never officially closed. It remains open to this day with no new suspects ever named. But the question that lingers over Camp Scott, the question that the families asked and never received an honest answer to, is not just who did this. The question is who read that note, understood what it said, looked at the dates on the calendar, and decided that the camp schedule was more important than the warning in their hands. That person was never identified publicly. That decision was never investigated as its own separate crime. 3 girls were murdered in a tent in the Cherokee Hills, and someone had been told it was going to happen. Now we need to go to the Adirondacks, to a camp called Whispering Pines, sitting near the western edge of the Adirondack Park in upstate New York, where in the summer of 1978, a 22-year-old camp counselor named Paul LaRue went into the woods on a Tuesday evening and did not come back. Paul was a second-year counselor. He was studying environmental science at a college in Vermont. He was the kind of counselor the kids liked because he actually knew the names of the trees and the birds and could identify animal tracks in the mud without looking them up. He had taken this particular overnight hiking group out before. The route was established. The campsite was pre-approved. There was nothing unusual about the trip. The group of 8 campers, boys between 13 and 15, had set up camp at a designated clearing about 4 miles from the main facility. They made dinner. They went to sleep. And at some point during the night, Paul LaRue walked away from the campsite and was never seen again. He was not there in the morning. His sleeping bag was still in his tent. His boots were beside the sleeping bag. His camp identification was in his jacket pocket, hanging from a tent pole. His flashlight was on the ground near the fire ring. He left without his boots. The boys woke up and waited for him. When he had not appeared by mid-morning, one of the older campers hiked back to the main camp to report it. Search and rescue teams were mobilized within hours. They covered the area in a grid pattern for 6 days. They used dogs. They searched the lake. They searched every trail within a 10-mile radius. They found nothing, no body, no clothing, no sign that Paul LaRue had walked, fallen, or crawled in any direction from that campsite. The search dogs tracked his scent to the edge of the clearing and stopped. Every dog at the same place, at the edge of the tree line just past the fire ring. The scent simply ended. Paul LaRue was officially declared a missing person. His case was eventually reclassified years later as a presumed accidental death. The Adirondacks are vast and unforgiving, and people do die there from exposure, from falls, from getting turned around in the dark. This is the explanation that goes in the file, but 3 of the 8 campers who were there that night described something that was never included in any official report. All three of them, independently, when interviewed by a local journalist in 1994 as part of a retrospective piece on the case, described seeing lights above the tree line on the night Paul disappeared. Not lights from the camp, not flashlights, not stars. These were lights that moved slowly at treetop level without sound above the forest to the north of their campsite. One of the boys said they watched the lights for what felt like 20 minutes before they fell asleep. Another said the lights were there when he woke up to use the bathroom at some point in the middle of the night, still moving, still silent, in the same area of sky. The third boy, who was 15 in 1978 and in his late 40s when the journalist spoke to him, said something more specific. He said that at one point during the night, he heard Paul unzip his tent. He heard footsteps on the dry ground, heading away from the campsite in the direction of the lights. He did not hear footsteps returning. He assumed Paul was checking on something and went back to sleep. None of this appears in the search and rescue report. None of this appears in the missing person case file. The 1994 journalist did include it in her piece for a regional alternative newspaper, but the story did not gain traction beyond the local area, and the paper itself folded in 2001. The archived copies of that issue are very difficult to find. Paul LaRudy's parents spent years pushing for a full reinvestigation. His mother wrote letters to the sheriff's department, to the state police, to her congressperson. She received responses that were uniformly courteous and empty. She died in 2009 without ever receiving what she called a real explanation for how her son could simply cease to exist in the middle of a forest. His father outlived her by 4 years. In an interview conducted just before his death, he said something that has stayed with everyone who has looked into this case. He said, "Paul did not run away. Paul did not fall down a hill. Paul did not wander off and freeze." He said, "Something came for my son, and I do not know what it was, and no one who was paid to find out ever tried hard enough to tell me." Whispering Pines Camp closed in 1983, 5 years after Paul disappeared. The closure was attributed to declining enrollment and increasing insurance costs. Former campers from those years describe a facility that never fully recovered from what happened. Counselors quit. Parents pulled their kids. The atmosphere changed. One former camper who attended the summer immediately after Paul's disappearance said that the staff had been instructed not to discuss the incident with campers under any circumstances, and that when he asked a counselor about it directly, the counselor looked at him with an expression he described as not quite fear, but something adjacent to it, and changed the subject. Paul LaRudy would be 68 years old today. His case remains officially open. There is a third story, and it is different from the first two in one important way. The first two cases are tragedies where the truth was incomplete, or buried, or simply never found. The third case is something more calculated. The third case involves people who knew exactly what was happening, kept meticulous records of it, and made deliberate decisions, year after year for nearly a decade, to make sure no one outside a very small circle ever found out. Camp Marland was a private summer camp operating in the hills of western Massachusetts from 1955 until 1974. when the land was sold to a real estate development company. It was the kind of camp that traded on its prestige, the kind of camp where families paid significant money to send their children, where the waiting list stretched years, where the alumni included local politicians and business figures who had attended as boys in the 1950s and early 1960s. Between 1962 and 1971, 4 campers died at Camp Marland, 4 children. Each death was ruled an accident, and by every public record available in those years, that is exactly what they appeared to be. The first death, in 1962, was a 12-year-old boy who drowned in the camp swimming lake during an open swim period. Drowning deaths at camps, while devastating, are not unheard of. An investigation was conducted. The camp was cited for inadequate supervision. A fine was paid. The family received a private settlement. Camp Marland opened the following summer. The second death, in 1965, was a 10-year-old boy who fell from a rock face during a hiking activity. Again, an investigation. Again, a private settlement. Again, the camp opened the following summer. The third death, in 1968, was a 13-year-old who died in the infirmary from what was recorded as a severe allergic reaction. His family had disclosed his allergy on his intake forms. The EpiPen protocol that should have been in place was not followed. The camp's physician, who was a part-time arrangement, was not on the grounds when the reaction occurred. Settlement. Confidentiality agreement. The camp opened the following summer. The fourth death, in 1971, was an 11-year-old boy who died from what was described as heat stroke during a camp-wide athletics day. Temperatures that day, according to weather records, were in the mid-80s. Not extreme. The boy had been showing signs of distress for at least an hour before anyone took action, according to 2 other campers who were present and later tried to report what they had seen. Those reports went nowhere. In 2019, a woman cleaning out the attic of a house in Springfield, Massachusetts, discovered a wooden trunk that had belonged to her late father. Her father had been the director of Camp Marland from 1959 to its closure in 1974. Inside the trunk were personal journals covering those 15 years. She began reading them, expecting to find memories of a happy career working with children. What she found instead were detailed, methodical entries describing each of the 4 deaths, the negotiations with each family, the amounts of the settlements, the names of the attorney who drafted the non-disclosure agreements, and the conversations her father had with the local sheriff's department about making sure the official reports reflected nothing that would threaten the camp's operating license. One entry, written in the days after the third death in 1968, reads in part as a clinical accounting of liability management. The director did not write about the child who died. He wrote about the exposure risk and the timeline for resolution. The woman brought the journals to a journalist at a regional investigative outlet in 2020. The resulting investigation ran over 3 parts and documented not only the 4 deaths, but 2 additional incidents, non-fatal but serious, that had also been quietly buried. It documented the payments made to families, several of whom had relatives still living, who confirmed receiving settlement money and signing documents that prohibited them from discussing what had happened. One of those relatives, an elderly woman whose nephew was the boy who drowned in 1962, said that her family had been told signing was the right thing to do. They had been told it would protect the other families. They had been told that making noise would only make things worse for everyone. She was in her 90s when she said this. She had never told anyone. The sheriff's department, whose records were cited in the journals, no longer exists. The county reorganized its law enforcement structure in the late 1980s. Records from before that reorganization are, in the language of the county archivist, largely unaccounted for. The attorney named in the journals died in 1997. The camp director, the woman's father, died in 2006. The development company that purchased the Camp Marland land in 1974 built a residential subdivision on it. Families live there now. Their children play in yards that sit on the same ground where 4 boys died, and where every person who had the power to make it matter chose not to. No criminal charges were ever brought. The statute of limitations on civil liability expired decades ago. The investigative series won a regional journalism award. And then the news cycle moved on, the way the news cycle always does. What connects these 3 cases, what runs underneath all of them like a current, is not the horror of what happened. Horror alone doesn't explain why these cases linger. What lingers is the layer beneath the horror. The question of who knew, and when they knew it, and what they decided to do with what they knew. A camp administrator who held a note predicting murder and opened the gates anyway. A search and rescue operation whose reports excluded the testimony of 3 eyewitnesses. A director who sat in his study after a child died on his grounds and calculated what the silence was worth. These are not simply stories about terrible things happening in isolated places. They are stories about what happens when institutions decide that protecting themselves matters more than protecting the children in their care. When the people responsible for safety decide that safety is a liability to be managed rather than a responsibility to be honored. The summer of 1977. The summer of 1978. 9 summers between 1962 and 1971. Children who left home in June and did not come back. Parents who spent the rest of their lives asking questions that deserved real answers and received paperwork instead. The tents at Camp Scott are still standing, overgrown and collapsed in places, out in the Cherokee Hills above 10 Killer Lake. The Adirondack Forest, where Paul LaRudy's scent ended at the edge of a clearing, is still wild and vast and indifferent. And somewhere in western Massachusetts, under a quiet subdivision where families go about their lives, the ground holds 4 boys who deserved so much better than what the adults around them chose to give them. These cases are not closed. Not really. Not in the way that matters. If you want to see what happens when the people responsible for keeping children safe fail them in ways that were never fully accounted for, the next video is on screen right now.